We are here for day 223 of the Daily Bread Bible Study. This is Thursday, August 20th, 2020, and we conclude today Jeremiah with chapters 51 through 52. We are continuing in the theme, starting off last time, all of chapter 50 and the judgment of Babylon. Chapter 51 is about the judgment of Babylon as well too, and then in chapter 52 we jump back reflecting on Babylon's siege of Jerusalem, what makes them so bad, and why we have to spend 2 chapters judging them here in Jeremiah. But picking it up in chapter 51, verse 1, "Thus says the Lord, I'm going to stir up a destructive wind against Babylon." And in verse 24, "I will repay Babylon and all the inhabitants of Chaldea before your very eyes, and for all the wrong that they have done in Zion, says the Lord." In verse 34, we also have, "King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon has devoured me. He has crushed me, he has made me like an empty vessel. He has swallowed me like a monster. He has filled his belly with my delicacies and has spewed me out. May my torn flesh be avenged on Babylon, the inhabitants of Zion shall say. May my blood be avenged on the inhabitants of Chaldea, Jerusalem shall say. Therefore, thus says the Lord, I am going to defend your cause and take vengeance for you." God is the one who will deliver vengeance. It is not the people of Jerusalem who have a lot of anger against Babylon for the siege of Babylon, where people got, they ran out of food, they starved, and they were just choked out. It felt terrible, and even still after that, they experienced the sword. We see that God promises to utterly destroy Babylon and not going to be those people of Jerusalem. We see here, continuing on after 60 verses in this chapter and plenty of verses in the one previously, the destruction against Babylon. And these words of Jeremiah are recorded on a scroll and tossed into the river Euphrates. In Jeremiah 51:63, the strange thing is spoken of. "When you finish reading this scroll, tie a stone to it and throw it into the middle of the Euphrates, and say, Thus shall Babylon sink to rise no more, because of the disasters that I am bringing upon her." Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. That's how chapter 51 closes. Jeremiah doing this last prophetic task of representing God, of speaking judgment on Babylon and throwing it into the river. Remember, Jeremiah did some strange things previously, including the whole having a yoke around him physically, so that way he could be able to model off the enslavement they would have in Babylon. He's no shortage or stranger to doing things that are kind of symbolic. He takes a earthenware jar and drops it in front of the leaders there in the earlier chapters to show the brokenness of their relationship with God. Anyways, he has all these illustrations, but this one is finally for Babylon. Now, in Jeremiah 52, we have the kind of just finished off with the last image of Jeremiah, and now we go back to exploring why it was so bad to begin with. The book of Jeremiah ends with remembrance of the utter desolation caused by the destruction of Jerusalem. In Jeremiah 52, verse 3, it says, "Indeed, Jerusalem and Judah so angered the Lord that he expelled them from his presence, and Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon." This rebellion by the king Zedekiah led to a siege over Jerusalem, as I mentioned previously, where all food was cut off from the town. Mercifully, it kind of glosses over those details. with only King Zedekiah's suffering really captured in depth. In verse 10, it reminds us of the king of Babylon killed his sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and killed all the officers of Judah at Riblah. He put out the eyes of Zedekiah and bound him in fetters. And the king of Babylon took him to Babylon and put him in prison until the day of his death. Now the nobility were either killed or taken to Babylon, as I mentioned, and the poor were left to work in the region of Judah for Babylon. Additionally, the temple was destroyed and desecrated. In verse 17, the pillars of bronze that were in the house of the Lord, the stands and the bronze sea that were in the house of the Lord, the Chaldeans broke into pieces and carried all the bronze to Babylon. The worship vessels, the holy place of God, the temple that King Solomon had made to fulfill the promise of King David, all of this came to pass and was in disrepair. It was destroyed in the siege of Jerusalem, and also too we see that the holy objects are taken out of the temple. In a summarizing of the number of people and when it happened of the exile, we have in verse 28, this is the number of people whom Nebuchadnezzar took into exile. In the 7th year, 3,023 Judeans. And in the 18th year, he took into exile from Jerusalem 832 persons. In the 23rd year, the captain of the guard took into exile all the Judeans, 745 persons. And all the persons total were 4,600. In a strange kind of ending from this, there is a glimmer of hope for Judah. In Jeremiah 52, verse 31, the king, evil Merodach, which I find just hilarious. King Evil Merodach of Babylon, right? Evil, as in, here in English we call things evil, but there's probably more significance in Hebrew here. But Merodach being, the name of referencing a god there in Babylon. So Merodach is evil. It's kind of silly. But at least that's one last dig that Jeremiah gets to get in there on Babylon. So this evil king, there in the year he began to reign, he showed favor to King Jehoiachin of Judah and brought him out of prison. So even in the midst of evil, even in the midst of oppression in Babylon, even in the midst of exile, God is going to raise up leaders of Judah before some of the other kings there. Only through the blessing of God can people be lifted up even in the midst of Babylon. That is where the story of the book of Daniel will be taking place in that sentiment. And we will, from here on out, whenever we talk about Babylon and those stories, be able to explore and see the ways in which God will provide for God's people, even in the midst of exile and oppression. So there you have it. That's the end of Jeremiah. Thank you for studying this book with me. It's been a long, kind of hard book. It doesn't have an easy message, but it is one that helps us remember that when we focus on God, we receive God's blessings, and that ultimately God will correct us one way or another. So thanks for joining me. Look forward to starting the book of Jeremiah next time. The book of Lamentations next time.